He thought he had already lost everything the night his wife died giving birth. But he was about to realize he hadn't even begun to understand what loss meant. The security monitor flickered softly in the dim glow of Kang Ji-hyun's private study, casting cold blue light across the marble floor as rain traced slow lines down the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Seoul's skyline. And for a man who controlled entire districts with a single phone call, the only thing he couldn't control was the sound echoing through the silent mansion. The sharp, relentless cry of his infant son that had not stopped for nearly 6 hours. Ji-hyun stood motionless, one hand resting against the edge of his desk, jaw tight, eyes dark and unreadable as he watched the live feed from the third-floor nursery, a room no one was allowed to enter without his permission, a rule spoken once and never questioned again, not by staff, not by guards, not by anyone who valued their place in his world. Yet on the screen, that rule was being broken. A woman moved into frame, small, careful, almost ghost-like in her presence, her dark skin contrasting against the pale gold light of the nursery lamps, her uniform simple, her posture hesitant, as if every step forward was a negotiation with fear itself. Maya Johnson had only been in the house for 11 days, just another hired hand in a rotation of staff who never lasted long enough to learn the rhythms of the place. But something about her now made the air in the room shift, even through a screen. She paused at the edge of the crib, listening, her hand hovering as the baby's cries grew sharper, more desperate, the kind that didn't fade with time but clawed deeper, more urgent, more raw. Downstairs, a team of specialists had already failed, imported formulas untouched, doctors dismissed, instructions exhausted, and yet here she was, breaking the one rule that mattered. Ji-hyun's eyes narrowed slightly as his thumb hovered over his phone, one command. Away from having her removed, one word away from restoring order, because that was what he did. He corrected disruptions, eliminated risks, maintained control, but his hand didn't move. On the screen, Maya glanced once over her shoulder, as if sensing something watching, something unseen, and then, slowly, she reached into the crib and lifted the child in her arms. The crying didn't stop. At first, it only changed, softer but still desperate, the small body tense against her chest. And for a moment she stood there, frozen, caught between instinct and consequence, between what she knew she shouldn't do and what she couldn't ignore. Then something shifted. Her shoulders lowered, her breathing steadied, and with a trembling motion that carried both hesitation and certainty, she did something no contract, no rulebook, no security protocol could have predicted. Ji-hyun leaned forward slightly, the faint creak of leather the only sound in the room as the monitor captured every detail. The quiet, the stillness, the unbearable tension of a moment that felt like it shouldn't exist. The baby's cries began to fade, not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually, like a storm losing its strength, until what remained was silence, fragile and unfamiliar, stretching across the room like something sacred. Ji-hyun's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. Something that hadn't surfaced since the hospital, since the sterile white lights and the silence that followed them. Since the moment he had realized that power meant nothing in a room where life could disappear without permission. On the screen, Maya didn't look triumphant, didn't look relieved. She only looked still, her gaze lowered, her hand steady now, as if she had stepped into a memory she wasn't supposed to revisit. The baby rested against her, calm for the first time in days, and for a long second, Ji-hyun forgot to breathe. Then his phone buzzed softly in his hand, breaking the moment, and the world rushed back in, sharp and cold and controlled. And with a single motion, he turned away from the screen, already moving toward the door, because whatever was happening in that room was no longer something he could watch from a distance. By the time Kang Ji-hyun reached the third floor, the mansion had fallen into a silence, so complete it felt unnatural, as if even the walls were holding their breath. And with each step down the dimly lit corridor, the sound that had once filled the house with desperation was gone, replaced by something far more unsettling to a man like him. Peace he did not understand. The guard stationed outside the nursery straightened immediately when they saw him. their eyes flickering with uncertainty. Because they had heard the cries too, had felt the tension ripple through the estate, and now they did not know what awaited behind that door. Ji-hyun did not acknowledge them, his presence alone enough to still the air, and without hesitation, he pushed the door open. The room was bathed in soft amber light, the kind meant to comfort a child, but what he saw inside was something no preparation could have made ordinary. Maya Johnson stood near the window, her back partially turned, her figure outlined by the faint glow of the city beyond, and in her arms, his son rested in a calm that had been impossible just minutes before. The small rise and fall of the baby's chest was steady now, his tiny fingers loosely curled, his face relaxed in a way Jae-hyun had not seen since the hospital, before everything had gone wrong. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Maya sensed him before she saw him, her body stiffening almost imperceptibly, her breath catching as she slowly turned to face the man whose name carried weight far beyond the walls of this house. Her eyes met his, and there was no defiance there, no attempt to justify or explain, only a quiet acceptance of whatever consequence would follow. She adjusted her hold on the baby slightly, careful, deliberate, as if shielding him from something unseen, and then she spoke, her voice soft but steady. He was hungry. The words hung in the air, simple and undeniable, cutting through every rule that had been broken to arrive at this moment. Jae-hyun's gaze did not leave her, his expression carved from something harder than anger, something deeper than control, as his mind struggled to reconcile what he had seen on the screen with the reality standing in front of him. He had built his world on certainty, on lines that were never crossed, on consequences that followed without hesitation, and yet here was a situation that refused to fit into any of those structures. His eyes shifted briefly to his son, taking in the calm, the quiet, the undeniable truth that no amount of money, no influence, no command had been able to achieve what this woman had done in a matter of minutes. Maya remained still, her shoulders squared despite the tremor in her hands, and in the silence, something else became visible, something Ji-hyun had not noticed through the camera. The faint, pale line just beneath the edge of her collar. A scar that told a story he did not yet fully understand but instinctively recognized. His gaze lingered there for only a second, but it was enough. A memory surfaced uninvited, sharp and unrelenting. The sterile brightness of a hospital room, the sound of machines that had once promised life and then delivered silence, the weight of a loss that no power could undo. He blinked once, the present snapping back into place. And when he spoke, his voice was lower than before, stripped of something that had once made it absolute. How long? Maya hesitated, not because she did not understand the question, but because answering it meant stepping further into a truth she had tried to bury. "A few minutes," she said quietly, her eyes never leaving his, just enough to help him stop hurting. Another silence followed, heavier now, filled with everything neither of them said. The rules of the house, the expectations, the invisible lines that had been crossed. All of it hovered between them, waiting for judgment. Ji-hyun took a step forward, slow and deliberate, closing the distance not as a threat, but as something else entirely, something that neither of them had expected when this night began. And in that moment, the man who had spent his life enforcing control stood at the edge of a decision that would either restore the world he knew or change it in a way he could never take back. The distance between them felt smaller now, yet heavier, as if every inch carried the weight of something neither of them had chosen, but both of them understood. And Kang Ji-hyun stopped just a few feet away, close enough to hear the quiet rhythm of his son's breathing, a sound that had been missing for far too long. He did not reach for the child, did not interrupt the fragile calm that had settled over the room, because even he could sense that this moment did not belong to him, not yet. Maya stood her ground, though every instinct told her to step back, to apologize, to explain herself in an invisibility the way she had learned to do in every place she had ever worked. But something about the way the baby rested against her, the way his small hand clung to the fabric of her shirt, kept her rooted where she was. Ji-hyun's eyes moved again, not to her face, This time, but to the way she held the child, the natural certainty in her posture, the quiet confidence of someone who had done this before, not as a job, but as something far deeper. "You have done this before," he said, not as a question, but as a recognition, his voice low and measured, carrying none of the sharp authority his staff feared, but something more dangerous, something searching. Maya's throat tightened, and for a brief moment, the silence stretched long enough to make the air feel thin, but she did not look away, because she knew that looking away would turn this into something it was not, something weaker than the truth. "Yes," she answered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I had a daughter." The words settled into the room like a quiet confession, and something in Ji-hyun's expression shifted again, subtle but undeniable, as if a piece of a puzzle he had not known he was solving had just fallen into place. "Had," he repeated softly, and the single word carried more weight than anything louder could have. Maya's grip on the baby tightened just slightly, not enough to disturb him, but enough to anchor herself in the present. She was 4 months old, she said, and now her voice trembled, not from fear of him, but from a memory she could not fully contain. "She got sick, and I could not afford the treatment in time." The room seemed to grow quieter with each word, as if even the city beyond the windows had faded away to listen. Ji-hyun did not interrupt, did not move, and for the first time since he had entered, he was not the man in control of the situation, but a man standing in front of a truth that mirrored his own in a way he could not ignore. Images flashed through his mind without warning, not in clear detail, but in fragments. The sterile scent of antiseptic, the sound of a monitor that had once beeped steadily and then stopped. The moment when he had been told that his wife was gone, and that their child had barely survived. He had buried that moment beneath layers of control and routine, had built walls strong enough to keep it from surfacing. But now, standing here, watching this woman hold his son with a care he had not been able to provide himself, those walls felt thinner than they ever had. "And you are still," he began, but the sentence did not finish because he did not need to say it out loud. Maya understood anyway, her gaze softening just slightly, not with pity, but with something more grounded, something shared. "My body did not forget," she said quietly, "even if my life had to move on." The honesty of it settled between them, unpolished and undeniable, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke again. The baby stirred slightly in her arms, a small movement that drew both of their attention at once, and instinctively, Maya adjusted her hold, her hand supporting his head with a precision that spoke of memory, not training. Jae-hyun watched that movement closely, and something inside him, something he had not allowed himself to feel, shifted into place. This was not a violation of his rules, not a threat to his control, but something far more complicated, something that did not fit into the world he had built. He exhaled slowly, a breath he had not realized he was holding. And when he looked at her again, the decision forming in his mind was no longer about punishment or correction, but about something he had never had to consider before. And in that quiet room, with the rain still tracing patterns against the glass and the city lights flickering beyond, Kang Jae-hyun stood at the edge of choice that would redefine not only the rules of his house, but the man he believed himself to be. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, slowly and almost imperceptibly, as Kang Jae-hyun straightened his posture, the weight of his decision settling into something solid, something irreversible. And when he finally spoke again, his voice carried a quiet authority that no longer felt cold, but deliberate, measured in a way that made every word matter. "No one else has been able to do this," he said, his gaze lowering briefly to his son before returning to Maya. And there was no accusation in his tone, no trace of the rigid rules that had governed this house until now, only a recognition of fact. Maya did not respond immediately, not because she did not understand, but because she felt the shift too subtle but undeniable, like the moment before a storm changes direction. She adjusted her hold on the baby once more, careful not to wake him, and nodded slightly, her voice soft. He just needed to feel safe. The simplicity of her answer lingered in the air, stripping away every layer of complexity Ji-hyun had built around the problem. reducing it to something so human it almost felt unfamiliar to him. Safe, not managed, not controlled, not fixed, but safe. The word settled deep, echoing against memories he had tried to bury, memories of a hospital room where safety had met. Nothing despite every resource at his disposal. He took another step closer, close enough now that the faint scent of rain clung to his coat, blending with the warmth of the nursery, and for the first time, he extended his hand, not in command, but in hesitation. Maya watched him carefully, her body still, her instincts sharp, because this moment mattered in ways she could not yet define. He paused, his hand hovering just inches from his son, as if uncertain whether he had the right to disturb the peace that had finally been achieved. "May I?" he asked, the question so quiet it almost disappeared into the room, and yet it carried a weight that shifted everything between them. Maya's eyes widened slightly, not because of the request itself, but because of what it meant, because men like him did not ask. They decided, they commanded, they took, and yet here he was waiting, allowing her to choose. She nodded gently, her movements slow and careful as she guided the baby toward him, ensuring the transition would not wake him. Her hands steady despite the gravity of the moment. When Jae-hyun finally took his son into his arms, something in his posture changed, subtle but profound, as if the act itself required a different kind of strength than anything he had known before. He held the child close, his expression unreadable, but his grip careful, protective in a way that felt new even to him. The baby stirred slightly, his small fingers brushing against the fabric of Jae-hyun's shirt, and for a brief second, the tension returned, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face, but then the child settled again, still calm, still at peace, and Jae-hyun exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him as if it had been held for days. He looked up at Maya, then really looked at her not as staff, not as someone beneath his notice, but as the person who had done what he could not. The silence stretched again, but this time it was different, no longer heavy with judgment, but filled with something quieter, something that felt almost like understanding. "From this moment on," he said, his voice steady, carrying through the room with quiet certainty, "you will not follow the same rules as the others." Maya's heart skipped, the words landing with both relief and uncertainty, because she knew that nothing in this house came without consequence, even kindness. Jae-hyun shifted the baby slightly in his arms, ensuring he remained comfortable, and continued, "You will stay close to him whenever he needs you." The statement was simple, but the implication was vast, reshaping the structure of a household built on hierarchy and distance. Maya swallowed, her voice barely audible as she answered, "Yes, sir," though the word felt different now, less like submission and more like acknowledgement. Jae-hyun held her gaze for a moment longer, as if confirming something unspoken, and then he turned slightly toward the door, where the guards still waited, unaware that the rules they had followed without question had just been rewritten. And in that quiet nursery, under the soft glow of a single lamp, a new order began to take shape, one not built on control alone, but on something far more fragile and far more powerful. The door opened before Kang Jae-hyun could reach for it, one of the guards stepping forward instinctively, but he stopped the man with a single glance, not sharp or threatening, but firm enough to redraw the line that had just shifted inside the room. And for a brief second, the guard hesitated, confusion flickering across his face because something in his employer's demeanor had changed in a way he could not define. Jae-hyun stepped into the hallway with his son still in his arms, the baby, resting quietly against his chest. And the sight alone was enough to alter the atmosphere, because no one in this house had ever seen him like this, not holding anything with such care, not moving with such measured restraint. Maya followed a step behind, her hands now empty, yet her presence still tethered to the child, as if an invisible thread connected them, something even distance could not sever. The hallway lights cast long shadows across the polished floor, and as Jae-hyun walked, the guards fell in a step at a respectful distance, unsure whether to intervene or remain silent, because the rules they had memorized no longer seemed to apply in the same way. He stopped near the end of the corridor, turning slightly as if considering something beyond the walls, beyond the structure of the house itself. And then he spoke without looking back, his voice carrying just enough to be heard. From now on, she has access to this floor at all times. The words landed with quiet force, not loud, not dramatic, but final in a way that left no room for interpretation. The guards exchanged brief glances, their training urging them to question the change, but experience teaching them not to, and one of them nodded, acknowledging the command without a single word. Maya stood still, absorbing what had just been granted to her, understanding that in a place like this, access was not convenience, it was power, and power always came with a cost. She lowered her gaze slightly, not out of submission, but out of careful awareness, knowing that every step forward from this moment would be watched more closely than before. Ji-hyun resumed walking, slower now, as if adjusting to the unfamiliar weight in his arms, and for a brief moment, his attention shifted entirely to the child, the rise and fall of his small chest, the warmth pressed against him, the quiet that still felt almost unreal. "What is his name?" Maya asked softly, the question slipping out before she could stop it, and for a second, the guards tensed because no one asked personal questions, not like that. Not to him. Ji-hyun paused again, the question settling into the space between them. And when he answered, his voice carried something different, something that did not belong to the world of control and command. Min-jun, the name lingered, simple and human, and Maya repeated it quietly, as if anchoring it to memory. Min-jun. The baby stirred slightly at the sound, a small movement that drew both of their attention at once. And without thinking, Maya stepped closer, her hand hovering just near enough to reassure without overstepping, her presence instinctive rather than calculated. Ji-hyun noticed the movement, the way she responded without hesitation, without fear, and something in his expression softened again, almost imperceptibly, as if he was beginning to understand a language he had never learned. They reached the main staircase, the vast space below stretching open with its polished stone and towering windows, a place designed to impress, to dominate, to remind anyone who entered of who held power here. But tonight, that power felt quieter, less certain in its usual form. Ji-hyun looked down at the expanse for a moment, then back at Maya, and there was a brief pause, one that carried more weight than any command because this was no longer just about rules or roles, but about something far less defined. "You will move your things to the room beside his," he said finally, his tone steady but no longer distant. "It will be prepared tonight." Maya's breath caught slightly, the significance of the statement settling in, because proximity in this house was not given lightly. It was reserved, controlled, earned in ways she did not yet fully understand. She nodded slowly, her voice quiet but clear. "Yes, sir." Ji-hyun held her gaze for a moment longer, as if measuring something unseen. And then he turned, descending the staircase with Min-jun still resting peacefully in his arms, leaving behind a silence that felt different from before, not empty, but full of something that had begun to take shape, something that neither of them could yet name, but both of them could feel. The mansion did not sleep that night, even as the city beyond its walls slowly dimmed into the quiet hours before dawn, because something subtle but irreversible had shifted within its structure, and every person inside could feel it without fully understanding why. Maya stood alone in the room that had been prepared for her, just steps away from Min-jun's nursery, her small suitcase resting unopened on the edge of the bed as she took in the unfamiliar space, the soft lighting, the polished surfaces, the quiet that felt heavier here than anywhere else she had lived. It was not luxury that unsettled her, but proximity, because in this house, being close meant being seen, and being seen meant being judged. She exhaled slowly, steadying herself, her mind replaying the events of the night in fragments she could not quite piece together into something logical, because nothing about what had happened followed the rules she had learned to survive by. Across the hall, the nursery door remained slightly open, a soft line of light stretching into the corridor, and without thinking, Maya stepped toward it, her movements quiet, instinctive, as if drawn by something deeper than thought. Inside, Kang Ji-hyun sat in a chair near the crib, still dressed in the same dark clothing from earlier, his posture composed but no longer rigid, as if the weight he carried had shifted into something less defined. Min-jun rested in the crib now, sleeping peacefully, his small chest rising and falling in a rhythm that filled the room with a calm that had once seemed impossible. Ji-hyun did not look up when Maya entered, but he was aware of her presence immediately, the silence between them no longer tense, but charged with something quieter, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood. "He has not woken up," he said after a moment, his voice low, almost contemplative, as if he was still trying to believe it himself. Maya stepped closer, her gaze softening as she looked at the child, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. "He feels safe now," she replied gently, and the words carried no assumption, no claim, only a quiet certainty. Ji-hyun's eyes shifted briefly toward her, studying her in a way that was no longer distant or analytical, but searching, as if he was trying to understand not just what she had done, but who she was beneath it. "You speak as if you know him," he said, and there was no challenge in his tone, only curiosity. Maya hesitated for a fraction of a second, then answered honestly, "I know what it feels like when a child is afraid and no one understands why." The room fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now, one that carried memory instead of tension. Ji-hyun leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze drifting to the crib, and for a moment, the man who commanded entire networks and commanded respect without question looked like something else entirely. Something quieter, something closer to human than legend. "The doctors said it would pass," he said slowly, as if repeating something he had been told too many times to count. "That it was normal, that infants cry, that time would fix it." Maya did not respond immediately, because she knew those words, had heard them in different forms, in different rooms, from people who believed that time alone could heal what it often could not. "Sometimes," she said carefully, "time needs help." The simplicity of her answer lingered, settling into the space between them, and Ji-hyun nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible acknowledgement that carried more weight than agreement. He stood then, moving toward the crib with a quiet confidence that had not been there before, adjusting the blanket with a careful hand. His movements slower, more deliberate, as if he was learning something new with each motion. Maya watched him, not with judgment, not with expectation, but with a quiet awareness that this moment mattered in ways neither of them could fully articulate. When he turned back toward her, there was something different in his expression, something that had not been there before this night, something that suggested a shift, not just in action, but an understanding. "You will not be treated as staff," he said finally, his voice steady, leaving no room for doubt. "Not anymore." The words settled into the room with a quiet finality, and for a moment, Maya did not know how to respond, because she understood what he was offering, but she also understood the world that existed within, a world where nothing came without consequence. She nodded slowly, her voice soft but clear. "I understand." Ji-hyun held her gaze for a moment longer, as if confirming that she truly did, and then he turned back toward the crib, his attention returning to his son. But something in the room had already changed, something that extended beyond roles and rules, into something far more fragile and far more powerful than either of them had expected when the night began. Morning arrived slowly over Seoul, a pale gray light slipping through the tall windows of the mansion and settling gently across the marble floors. But inside the nursery, time seemed to move differently, measured not by clocks or schedules, but by the quiet, steady breathing of a child who had finally found rest. Maya had not slept, though she had tried, lying still in the unfamiliar bed only a few feet away, listening for any sound from across the hall, her body still attuned to the smallest shift, the faintest cry, the instinct to respond stronger than exhaustion itself. When the first soft sound came, barely more than a sigh, she was already on her feet, crossing the threshold into the nursery before her mind had fully caught up with her body. Min-jun stirred in his crib, his tiny hands moving slightly as if searching for something unseen. and Maya stepped closer, her presence calm, her movements gentle, her voice low as she murmured something soft and reassuring. Not words meant to be understood, but a tone meant to comfort. The baby settled almost immediately, his breathing evening out again, and Maya remained there for a moment longer, watching, ensuring the calm would hold before she became aware that she was not alone. Kang Ji-hyun stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the morning light behind him, his expression unreadable, yet his presence no longer carried the sharp edge it once had. He had been awake for hours, though he had not returned to his study, had not taken calls, had not resumed the routine that defined his world, because something here, in this room, had demanded his attention in a way nothing else had. "He listens to you," he said quietly, his voice carrying through the stillness without disturbing it. And it was not a question, but an observation that seemed to carry both curiosity and something deeper, something he had not yet named. Maya turned slightly, meeting his gaze with a calm that had grown from the events of the night. "He feels when someone is calm," she replied gently. "Children always do." Ji-hyun stepped into the room, his movements slower than usual, as if he was deliberately shedding the urgency that had once defined him. And for a moment, he simply stood there, watching the small, quiet scene unfold in front of him. Something so simple it felt almost foreign in a life built on complexity and control. "And if you are not here?" he asked after a moment, his eyes still on his son. And there was something in the question that revealed more than the words themselves, something that hinted at uncertainty, at a reliance he had not expected to form. Maya hesitated briefly, not because she did not have an answer, but because she understood the weight behind the question. "Then he will learn," she said softly. "But right now, he needs consistency, not confusion." The words settled between them, not as advice, but as truth, and Ji-hyun nodded once, slowly, as if absorbing something that could not be learned from instruction. Alone, there was a pause, a quiet space where neither of them spoke, and in that silence, the boundaries between them seemed to blur just slightly, no longer defined strictly by role or hierarchy, but by something more human, more shared. Ji-hyun's gaze shifted then, not to Maya, but to the small details of the room, the way she had adjusted the blanket, the way she positioned herself near the crib, the subtle changes that spoke of care rather than duty. "You have changed this room," he said. And again, it was not a question. Maya glanced around briefly, almost surprised, as if she had not been aware of it herself. "I only made it quieter," she answered. Ji-hyun considered that for a moment, then looked back at his son. The calm, the stillness, the absence of distress that had once defined this space. And something inside him shifted again, deeper this time, moving beyond observation into something closer to trust. "Stay," he said finally, the words simple, but carrying more weight than any command he had given before, because this was not about authority, not about control, but about something he was only beginning to understand. Maya did not respond immediately, her eyes moving from him to the child and back again, because she knew that staying meant more than proximity. It meant stepping further into a world she did not belong to, a world that could change her in ways she could not predict. But as Min-jun shifted slightly, settling again at the sound of her presence, the choice became clearer, not because it was safe, but because it was necessary. She nodded slowly, her voice quiet but certain. "I will stay." And in that moment, as the morning light grew stronger and the city beyond began to wake, something within the walls of that mansion began to take shape, not built on power or fear, but on something far more fragile and far more enduring. The rest of the house did not adjust as quickly as the nursery had, and by late morning, the quiet shift that had taken place upstairs began to ripple outward, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore, as staff moved through their routines with a new kind of hesitation, their glances lingering a second too long, their voices lowered even more than usual, because word had already spread without being spoken directly. Maya felt at the moment she stepped into the main kitchen, the polished steel surfaces reflecting not just light, but attention, eyes lifting briefly before dropping again, conversations pausing mid-sentence as she passed, She carried Minjun carefully in her arms, his small head resting against her shoulder, his breathing slow and even. And though she kept her posture steady, she was acutely aware that nothing about this scene fit into the expectations of anyone around her. One of the senior house staff, a woman who had worked there for years, approached cautiously, her expression controlled but edged with uncertainty. "Miss Johnson," she said, using a formality that had not been there before, "shall I prepare the feeding schedule?" Maya hesitated, not because she did not know the answer, but because she understood the implication behind the question. The attempt to reintroduce structure where something more instinctive had taken root. "Not yet," she replied gently, adjusting Min June slightly as he shifted in her arms. "He will let us know when he needs it." The woman nodded, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt, and stepped back without further comment. Across the room, two younger staff members exchanged a glance, their expressions a mix of curiosity and disbelief, because they had seen the same thing everyone else had heard whispered in fragments. That the child who had cried without pause for days had slept through the night. That the new nanny had done what specialists could not, and that the man who owned the house had not intervened. Maya moved through the space quietly, her focus entirely on the child, but the tension around her lingered, unspoken yet present, like a question no one dared to ask out loud. When she returned upstairs, the air felt different again, calmer, more contained, as if the shift that had unsettled the rest of the house had settled firmly here. Kang Ji-hyun stood near the large window at the end of the corridor, his phone in his hand, though the screen remained dark, his attention elsewhere. He turned slightly as she approached, his gaze moving first to his son, then to her, and for a brief moment, something unreadable passed between them, something that acknowledged the change without needing to define it. "They will question this," he said after a moment, his voice even, not concerned, but aware, as if he had already calculated every reaction that would follow. Maya nodded, not surprised. People question what they do not understand. Ji-hyun's expression shifted slightly, a faint narrowing of his eyes that suggested consideration rather than disagreement. "And do you understand it?" he asked. The question was direct, but not confrontational, and Maya paused, her gaze lowering briefly to Min-jun before lifting again, steady and clear. "I understand him," she answered. The simplicity of her response settled into the space between them, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then a voice echoed faintly from the staircase below, one of the guards announcing the arrival of a visitor, and the atmosphere shifted once more, tension threading through the calm like a reminder that the world outside this quiet space had not changed at all. Ji-hyun's posture straightened slightly, the familiar edge of authority returning to his presence, though it no longer felt as absolute as before. He glanced toward the stairs, then back at Maya, his gaze lingering for just a second longer than necessary, as if weighing something unseen. "Stay with him," he said, his tone firm but no longer distant, and without waiting for a response, he turned and moved toward the staircase, his steps measured, controlled, carrying him back into the world he had never truly left. Maya remained where she was, her hold on Min-jun steady, her presence calm. But as the sound of footsteps echoed faintly from below and voices began to rise in low, formal tones, she felt the fragile balance of the morning begin to shift again, because whatever waited downstairs was not part of this quiet understanding. And she knew, without needing to be told, that the change that had begun in this house would not remain untouched for long. The voices from downstairs carried upward in soft echoes, controlled yet unmistakably formal, the kind of tone reserved for conversations that mattered beyond the walls of a single home. And as Maya stood at the top of the staircase with Min-jun resting quietly against her shoulder, she understood that whatever had entered this house was not just a visitor, but a presence tied to the world Kang Ji-hyun had built long before she arrived. She did not move closer, did not lean to listen, but the tension in the air was enough to tell her that the fragile calm of the morning had been interrupted, not broken, but tested below, in the expansive sitting room framed by towering windows and polished stone. Ji-hyun stood across from a man whose presence commanded its own kind of attention. Older, composed, dressed in a way that suggested both wealth and expectation. And though his voice remained even, there was an undercurrent of something sharper, something probing. "I hear your household has become unconventional," the man said, his words measured, each one placed with intention. Jae-hyun did not respond immediately, his gaze steady, his posture relaxed in a way that masked the shift that had taken place within him, because the man in front of him knew him as he had always been, not as he was becoming. "My household functions as it needs to," Jae-hyun replied, his tone calm, offering nothing more than what was necessary. The man's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in assessment, as if weighing the difference between rumor and reality. "And the child?" he asked, his voice softening just enough to suggest interest rather than challenge. Jae-hyun's gaze flickered, just for a fraction of a second, toward the staircase above, where Maya stood unseen but not unconsidered, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a quiet certainty that had not been there before. "He is well." The simplicity of the answer seemed to settle something in the room, though not entirely, because questions still lingered, unspoken but present. Upstairs, Maya shifted slightly, her hand resting gently against Min-jun's back as he stirred, the faintest movement that drew her full attention back to him, away from the tension below, because whatever was unfolding downstairs belonged to a world she could not control. But this quiet responsibility in her arms was something she understood completely. The baby let out a soft sound, not a cry, but a small, uncertain noise, and Maya responded instinctively. Her voice low, soothing, her presence steady, and within seconds, the tension in his tiny body eased again, his breathing returning to its calm rhythm. Downstairs, the man's gaze followed Jae-hyun's earlier glance, his attention shifting upward, though he could not see what had drawn it, only sensed that something had changed in the dynamic of the house, something subtle but significant. "You have allowed someone new into your inner circle," he observed, not as a question, but as a conclusion. And this time, Jae-hyun did not deflect. He held the man's gaze, his expression composed, but his answer carried a quiet finality that left no room for interpretation. "I have allowed what is necessary." The words lingered, heavier than before, and for a moment, the room fell silent, the kind of silence that follows a statement that cannot be easily challenged. Upstairs, Maya remained where she was, unaware of the exact words spoken below, but fully aware that something had been decided, something that extended beyond her understanding but would inevitably shape her place in this house. She looked down at Min-jun, his face peaceful, his small hand resting lightly against her, and for a brief moment, everything else faded. The tension, the uncertainty, the weight of the world outside this moment, because in this quiet space, what mattered was simple, undeniable, and real. Downstairs, the man inclined his head slightly, acknowledging Jae-hyun's response without pressing further, because he recognized the tone, the finality, the shift, even if he did not yet understand its source. And as the conversation moved on to other matters, the kind that belonged to power and influence and control, something unspoken remained between them, a recognition that the balance within this house had changed. Above them, in the soft light of the upper floor, Maya stood with the child in her arms, unaware that her presence had just been acknowledged in a world far beyond her own. And as the quiet settled once more, there was a stillness that carried a different kind of weight, not fragile, not uncertain, but grounded in something that had already proven itself. And in that moment, without ceremony or declaration, the house, the man who ruled it, and the life within its walls had all shifted, not through force, not through command, but through something far quieter and far more enduring, in that day, without anyone saying it out loud. The world inside that mansion remembered what dignity looks like.